So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm really glad that you're with us here today. So welcome to the Federal Acquisition Regulation System and Introduction. This is the first of our webinars on federal acquisition regulations. And in this webinar, we will first discuss the Federal Acquisition Regulation System and where those rules come from. Then we're going to look at how it's organized and how to find information. Future webinars will look a little closer at specific areas of the regulation in more detail. The topics we are developing right now include FAR clauses for your annual representations and certifications. Those are the things that you fill out when you register in SAM. We're also looking at FAR references for simplified acquisitions, sealed bids, and negotiated acquisitions to basically compare how those work depending on the type of solicitation you're looking at. FAR references related to small businesses and with an emphasis there on small business set-asides. Also, we're looking at doing a little bit on the Department of Interior acquisition regulation and the Health and Human Services acquisition regulations. If there's another one that you would like us to look at, please drop me a note in the chat box and we will start looking at that. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Judy Warren, and I'm one of the procurement counsels here at the Tribal Government Institute Apex Accelerator, where we assist companies interested in selling to the government. Today's presentation will take about 30 minutes, after which we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. So go ahead and enter those questions in the question and answer box, and we will discuss them before we leave. And like I said, if I don't know the answer, we will go look for an answer for you. So we are a brand new Apex Accelerator, and we are happy to be here. Interesting. There we go. The little technical difficulty there. So what is an Apex Accelerator? We used to be known as PTAX because we offer procurement technical assistance. But today we're going to be calling us Apex Accelerators, and from this day forward, that's the terminology we will be using. On the screen now, you see the landing page for the TGIOK website, and you can learn a lot more about TGI by going to our website. We encourage you to do that. You can also find us on LinkedIn, and we hope that you will. This will help you get to know us a little bit better and see if there's something that we can do to help you. We also have a YouTube channel where we post some of our videos when they are complete. And we have a Facebook presence as well. So again, this is our landing page, and you will notice in the middle, this is application. So anyone who is not a client of TGI and wants to become one can click there and fill out a form and send it to us, and we will get you registered as a client. Today's topics are all about the FAR. So we're going to talk about background and authority, organization and contents, finding information, and we're going to look at some sample FAR references and some resources. First of all, the Federal Acquisition Regulation System is a system. It codifies and publishes uniform policies and procedures for acquisition throughout the federal executive branches or branch. Not every agency is covered by the FAR. There are some exceptions like the Federal Aviation Administration, but most executive agencies are covered by the FAR. So it's an overall guiding set of instructions for the acquisition community. The Federal Acquisition Regulation is the foundation. And this system also includes agency acquisition regulations that implement or supplement the FAR for that agency. So you will see call outs on defense contracts that have both FAR and DFARS clauses. When you filled out your SAM registration, if you said, yes, I want to try to sell to the DoD, then you had a second set of questions to answer. Sometimes the DFARS looks a little bit more stringent than some of the civilian agency supplements, but we'll be looking at those in future webinars. The FAR is prepared, issued, maintained, and prescribed jointly by the Secretary of Defense, the Administrator of the General Services Administration, and the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So there's a lot of people putting this together. As you can imagine, it takes a while to get things actually published. And we're going to talk about that at length too, because I think it's good to know where these things come from. FAR actually within its own document states its guiding principles. And one of them I think is very important for us to understand is that the acquisition team is allowed to use their own business judgment. The FAR gives them instructions on many things, but not everything in the world that can come up is covered by a regulation or an instruction. And when there are no instructions for their specific situation, as long as they do not do something that is prohibited, they can use their business judgment to decide what is the best option to proceed with. And it allows for innovation and in their acquisition strategies. Some of the things you may have seen in recent years include the federal strategic sourcing initiatives and even some other transaction agreements. The FAR states its vision to be delivering on a timely basis the best value product or service to their customer. And we'll talk about best value again at some point in the subsequent webinars. But real quickly, using a best value approach allows a trade-off so that we don't always see the government award to the lowest price offer, and we don't always see the government award to the best rated proposal. There's a trade-off between price and value. And while they do all of that, they are supposed to maintain the public's trust, and they will be fulfilling public policy objectives. And they talk about the participants in the acquisition process, and they say they should work together as a team. So, you know, you may have people who are involved with the program, or the people who need the parts out in the field, or people who need the service. And then you have a support team around them. And these are basically your requirements people. They decide what needs to be bought. And then you have the people who are actually doing the mechanics of purchasing it. They send out the solicitations and the notices. They evaluate the offers and make the award. All of those people have to work together as a team so that the government gets what it needs in a timely manner at a reasonable price while fulfilling public policy objectives, which do include being fair and reasonable with vendors. So they need to work together as a team, and they are empowered to make decisions within their area of responsibility. The vision includes satisfying the customer in terms of cost and quality and timeliness all at once. So there are several mechanisms that they use to do that. One is maximizing the use of commercial products and commercial services. And you'll see that that is covered in FAR Part 12. It's all about commercial products and services. They want to use contractors who have a track record of successful past performance or who demonstrate a superior capability to perform. Well, when we talk about past performance, there's an important distinction between experience and performance. You will build a resume that shows your experience, and you'll include that on things like your capability statement and your dynamic small business search profile. But past performance requires an objective valuation of performance by a third party, usually the customer. The government has systems where they collect that information. You may have heard of CPARs or PEPRs, and that's where they would go to file reports. And it goes by different names, but it's basically the same thing. It's contracting officers' evaluation of your performance that they complete, usually at contract closeout. If there's anything adverse put in it, you would be aware and be able to rebut it, basically explain why things went badly at some point. They're also looking to promote competition. When possible, we promote competition, and one of the primary reasons here is that with competition, we feel like we are assured of getting a fair and reasonable price. We also want to minimize administrative operating costs. So the rules for higher dollar purchases are more stringent. There's more guidelines attached. For small purchases, like teeny tiny purchases, there's far less administrative burden. And that's very logical. It's the same way you would do your decision making when you're spending your money. They also want to conduct business with integrity, fairness, and openness. There is an entire FAR part dedicated to business ethics, basically. It's FAR Part 3. And they also want to fulfill public policy objectives. That includes things like complying with the Clean Air Act, labor laws, Small Business Act, set-asides, and things of that nature. So how is the FAR maintained? It is not a static document. It will change with time. So it's prepared and issued through the coordinated action of two councils. You have the Defense Acquisition Regulatory Council, or DAR, and the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, or CAA Council. And then the FAR Secretariat, operated by GSA, prints and publishes the FAR. So it distributes it to everybody. I want to look a little bit at how the rules are made. Regulations are made, and it's a very procedural situation. It's a highly legal environment. So we're going to look at the rules and rulemaking. First, we're going to look at the Federal Acquisition System regulations, and also the Code of Federal Regulations and the U.S. Code. And then we're going to talk about finding some of the FAR clauses. This is not really intended to be an eye chart, but what it is intended to be is a representation of the fact that getting things into the FAR is not quick nor easy. There are several pathways. Usually you start with a statute or an executive order, but things are announced in the Federal Register. Legislation requires a public comment period, and we're going to talk about that in a bit too. There is a law called the Administrative Procedures Act. So once legislation is passed, Congress includes in that a responsibility for an agency to draft rules to implement that law. So the agency writes what we call a proposed rule, and they publish it in the Federal Register. They allow a public comment period, which is usually about 60 days. They review those comments, and usually publish a final rule shortly thereafter, and that rule will have the force and effect of law. So with the FAR, changes or proposed changes are posted in the Federal Register. Then it gets incorporated into the Code of Federal Regulations and the FAR, and it's published online at Acquisition Central. That's www.acquisition.gov, and in the Code of Federal Regulations, which you can find at ecfr.gov. So FAR is included in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's Chapter 1 of Title 48. The agency supplements to the FAR are published in additional chapters. And again, it's published in the Federal Register and codified so that it goes into Title 48. All of the agency regulations parallel the FAR. All the numbering systems are parallel. So FAR 52 includes the clauses, your basic clauses. DFARS 252 includes additional clauses called out by the DoD. HHSAR 352 includes additional clauses called out by Health and Human Services. And this is what the Federal Register looks like. And you see here, this was published Monday, June 26th. And it gives you an overall view of what's going on with regulations that day. And there's a search engine, so you can type in something to search for it. And if you want to search for something, like I put in CMMC, you can search and get some results. Here, the search for CMMC found 16 documents. Whoops. So I'm looking at my 16 documents and I have them sorted. You can sort by recency and look at the newest or the oldest, or you can sort by relevancy, and I picked relevancy. And I found Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification 2.0 updates and way forward. The PR in the circle there means that this is a proposed rule. So I clicked into the proposed rule, and this is what I found. It's going to give you a lot of good information. First, that it is an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, who issued it, where to find more information. And this one included something I wanted you to see, because I mentioned that public comments are reviewed before a final rule is issued. And here on this one, we find some interesting information. It says, in March of 2021, the department initiated an internal assessment of CMMC 1.0 implementation that was informed by more than 850 public comments in response to the interim DFARS rule. So they looked at 850 public comments, and they did not issue a final rule yet. They are issuing a notice here, and they say that the changes reflected in CMMC 2.0 will be implemented through the rulemaking process. And I think that's very assuring. When something is going to change in the FAR, and you have a feeling that it may impact your company in one way or another, you can go to the Federal Register and you can make comments to explain how this impacts your company and what they may have forgotten. Because sometimes that does have an impact. And you have a right to make your comment. This is the electronic Code of Federal Regulations. So once the rule has been formalized, it's finalized, the final rule will be put into the Code of Federal Regulations in the appropriate place. So here you see a Getting Started guide and a search function. And if you scroll through the table of comments, you might come to Title 13, and it's titled Business Credit and Assistance. That doesn't say Small Business Administration. And if you didn't know that Small Business Administration rules are included there, you might scroll right past it. But it is. Title 13, Chapter 1 is the Small Business Administration. So Title 13, 1 through 199 is all about small business. If you had done a keyword search to look for HubZone, you would have gotten 218 results, and it would have immediately keyed you in to the fact that 13 CFR 126 is the place to go for HubZone rules. And you can click through those pages. If you have a citation, it's really easy to find. If you don't, I think keyword search works pretty well. And you may wonder, well, why do I want to know this stuff? This is not the FAR. Well, not everything that you will see in your solicitations is completely covered in the FAR except by reference. So frequently the FAR will refer to the Code of Federal Regulations. Remember, the FAR is in Title 48, but some things will refer you back to Title 13. And if you were curious about the law itself, the statute, you could look that up. I find the easiest way to find that, for me anyway, is to go to the Cornell Law School website. And they also have search functions. And here we find the HubZone legislation at 15 U.S. Code. Oh, finally, we're going to talk about the FAR. Okay. So what's in the FAR? First of all, the way it's organized, there's a foreword, and then you have 51 parts that are instructions and guidance for the buyers and contracting officers. Part 52 includes the provisions and clauses. We call it a provision when it is in a solicitation. We call it a clause when it is in a contract. I think it is very useful to know that Part 52.3 includes a matrix, which will let you know what provisions and clauses are normally included in what type of contract. FAR 53 is forms, and Part 99 used to be called appendices. I tend to still call them appendices. There's one on cost accounting that you might find very interesting as a contractor. So the FAR, where can you find it? What's in it? How is it organized? And show me the clauses. You can find the FAR at Acquisition Central. This link, which will be in your handouts when you get them, is direct, will take you directly to Acquisition Central, and we'll be looking at that. Here's a link to the Code of Federal Regulations and the Cornell Law U.S. Code reference. So that's where you find them. Now, we went to acquisition.gov, and what did we find? A lot of information. First of all, there's a drop-down box at the top that will let you look at regulations, plural, and there is a search function. Searching with FAR works better when you know the terminology that the government is using to address the issue you want to learn about. If you just want to browse the FAR, you can click on Browse the FAR. But here I clicked on the regulations, and you can see how many there are. Every agency has a supplement. The DoD has the DFARS, their supplement, and then each military department has its own supplement. Civilian agencies also have their supplements. The one that we see people ask about the most usually is the General Services Administration, and theirs is the GSAM/R. But those rules are there. You also will see Health and Human Services, which includes the Indian Health Services, and you'll see the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Department of Interior. If you scroll down, you will also see an opportunity to sign up for FAR News. So if you are interested in keeping up with it like every day, this would be a good thing to sign up for. So now we're going to look at how the FAR is organized. It's divided into subchapters because remember it's part of Chapter 1 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So it's divided into subparts and then parts, subparts, sections, and subsections, paragraphs, etc. In the callouts, you do not see the subchapter. The citations will start with the FAR part. So here we have FAR Part 25, and then we have the dot. Then we have subpart 5 and section 04, then a hyphen, subsection 3, paragraph A. So this is going to be about foreign acquisition. The supplements are cited in the same way. They have the same basic pattern as the FAR. FAR 25 covers foreign acquisition, so DFARS 225 covers foreign acquisition as well. And here, the part of the DFARS is part 225. The subpart is 4. The section is 01, and the subsection is 70. This is a little confusing at first because there's no real divider between the subpart and the section, but you will get used to it. So the FAR contents again include the instructions and guidance, provisions and clauses, the matrix and the forms, and then the appendices. I've given you the subchapters here, but really they're only for information. The subchapters are part of the organizational scheme, so you can see how it's laid out, and it is very logical. But the citations you will see do not call out the subchapter. So, for example, subchapter A is just general information. So that includes FAR parts 1 through 5. And then competition and acquisition planning starts with part 6. So we're going to just glance through the topics on some of the parts that I think would be of the most interest to you. First is proper business practices and conflicts of interest. That's in FAR Part 3. Publicizing contract actions is in FAR Part 5. So if you want to know anything about why they publish some things and some things may not appear in SAM, this is where you could look. Competition requirements are covered in Part 6, and that will include the exceptions to competition, which would allow for sole source or other mechanisms. Sources of supplies and services, and that's going to address the priorities of where they get their supplies and services. Contractor qualifications is Part 9. I recommend reading Part 9. I repeat, I recommend reading Part 9. It's very important if you're the contractor. Part 10 covers market research. You will see the government put out notices that they call requests for information. Sometimes they'll put out draft solicitations or solicitations with draft statements of work. Part of what they're doing in some of these cases is doing their market research. The acquisition of commercial items is covered in FAR Part 12, and there is an important distinction, well, there are several important distinctions between the acquisition of commercial items and non-commercial items. So depending on what you're selling, this could be very important to you. Simplified acquisition procedures are covered in FAR 13, while sealed bidding is covered in 14 and contracting by negotiation in FAR Part 15. The types of contracts are covered in Part 16, and they're going to look at this like there are firm fixed price contracts and there are cost reimbursable contracts, and then there are varieties of those. Bonds and insurance, important to construction firms, covered in Part 28. Contract financing may or may not be of interest to you. That is in Part 32. Protests, disputes, and appeals are all about when there's a disagreement about what the contract really requires, etc. That is in FAR Part 33. Research and development contracts are different a little bit, so they have their own section in Part 35. Construction and architect engineering contracts fall under Part 36, and if you are in construction or architect engineer work, I suggest that you read that and read it and read it. It will make you feel so much like you speak their language. Okay, and service contracts are covered in Part 37. So if you have a janitorial service or a lawn care service or something of that nature, FAR Part 37 is one you want to become familiar with. If you are going after a GSA, Federal Supply Schedule contract, you will want to become familiar with Part 38. If you're selling information technology, you want to become familiar with Part 39. And Part 42 is really a reference. It covers contract administration. Subcontract policies and procedures are covered in Part 44. And you may not be aware of it, but sometimes you will be, your own purchasing system can be reviewed by the government for adherence to the policies and procedures in Part 44. Government property is covered in Part 45. So if you're going to be using government property in the performance of your contract, you'll want to look at that. Everyone is covered by quality assurance. Value engineering would really not apply to everyone. This is when you already have a contract and you see a better way to do it that will save the government money, and you suggest changing to that method. If the government adopts that and there's money saved, the contractor shares in the savings. Those rules are in Part 48. And termination of contracts is something everyone needs to be aware of. That's in Part 49. And there are different types of terminations, basically termination for convenience of the government and termination for default. Then the contract clauses, which is probably what you're most interested in today, are in Part 52. Again, that matrix is at 52.3 and forms are in 53. One of the things I wanted to be sure we covered was this little excerpt from FAR, because it relates to the authority of the contracting officer. The contracting officer has the authority to enter into the contracts, to terminate the contracts, administer the contracts. They can delegate some authority, but only the contracting officer can obligate money to pay you for something. As you begin performance on a contract, that may be important to know, because if your customer wants changes, you need to know that only contract modification will help you cover the cost of performing additional work. If they want something that doesn't cost you anything, it's not necessarily such a big deal, but you need to understand that the contract has not been modified because someone asked you to do something. And the contracting officers themselves have some limitations in their warrants sometimes. So they actually have those available for you to view if you want to. Some warrants are unlimited, but some warrants have a dollar value limit. It is possible that a contracting officer only has authority up to a certain dollar value. And this depends on what they're purchasing and the agency they're in. Ultimately, the contracting officers must ensure that all the requirements of law, executive order, regulations, and other applicable procedures, including clearances and approvals, have been met, then they sign it. So you can see why they're very, very picky about what they sign. And sometimes it might seem a little too picky to you, but it is their job. This is what they are required to do. Types of information in the FAR parts and subparts. Scope is at the very beginning of every part, and it summarizes the information that's in that part or subpart. And it may state that the rules in that part apply or do not apply to certain types of acquisitions. And that is important to note. Then it talks about applicability. And there's where they define the types of acquisitions that the part applies to. And that can be a standalone section, or it could be actually included in scope. And not all of these sections are included in all parts of the FAR, but I wanted to try to explain what the purpose of each one was when you see that heading. General describes the contents of the part, and it's usually more detailed than the scope section. Policy, I think, is very important because I frequently get questions from contractors about why something was included in their contract or why the government cares about something. So the way you understand that is by looking at the policy portion of the FAR part that you're concerned about. You'll also see exceptions. Sometimes it's called exceptions, exclusions, or limitations. But this is where they delineate the exceptions to the rules that are defined in that subpart. So I've seen that limitations on subcontracting may not apply to the unrestricted portion of a partial set aside. There are just cases where a rule applies to some things, but not others. There's small little exceptions. Procedures tell the buying activities, that's your agency, how to comply with that policy. And then the solicitation provisions and contract clauses include your terms and conditions. Remember, the provision applies when it's in the solicitation. Clause is the term that applies when it's in the contract. So here's an exception, a very important excerpt. This is FAR 9-104-1, and it's general qualifications. To be determined responsible, a prospective contractor must. Responsibility is an issue that the contracting officer has to determine before they award the contract. So they have to decide that you have adequate financial resources, that you're able to comply with the required delivery, that you have a satisfactory performance record and satisfactory record of integrity and business ethics, that you have the necessary organization, experience, accounting, and operational controls, etc., to perform this contract. If you are determined not responsible, it means that they don't believe you have all of the resources necessary to perform that specific contract. And there are some interesting things that are related to that we can look at in another webinar. FAR 9.1 will describe the standards and procedures for determining whether contractors and subcontractors are responsible. There are general standards, and there are also some very specific standards like being able to comply with a certain specification. The DFAR has a guide for non-regulatory policies and procedures. It's a web-based tool for the acquisition community. And it's used when specialty instructions are needed for individual military branches, etc. So, looking at the clauses, all clauses are found in Part 52. They are dated and will change. So when you've read it once and you think you know it, just make sure that the date hasn't changed. Some will have alternates, so you need to pay attention to which one's called out. If you look at the as prescribed in section, it will tell you why it's there. And remember that policy tells you the why. So we're looking at contract terms and conditions for commercial items here in this clause. This is one of your handouts. So I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly because we're running out of time and I want to get to the rest of it. Be careful not to use the far out of context if you use the search feature, but we're going to look at using the search feature. So I'm going to look at FAR 52219-14. What's it say? Is there an alternate called out? Have you seen it before? Where is the clause prescribed? And what can you tell about the policy? So first of all, it's saying the contractor agrees to limitations on subcontracting. And it details that that's different for service contracts, for supplies, for general construction, and for special trade contractors. Is there an alternate clause? Not on this one, but look out for those. What's the date on this clause? It was October 2022. So if you'd read it before October 2022, read it again. Where was it prescribed and where can you find more information? Okay. It was prescribed at FAR 19.507E. Look for the end of clause so you know you read the entire thing. And what can you tell about the policy? So going back to FAR 19, we find a general policy at FAR 19.201, and we find some specific policies at 19.202. What about the scope, applicability, and limitations? Okay, it's going to tell you what the limitations are and what the applicability is. This applies to small business set-asides above the simplified acquisition threshold, and it applies regardless of dollar value to set-aside contracts for small business set-aside contracts. If you have a general question, you can use the FAR search. Here I searched for cybersecurity and it was not helpful at all. The results apply to contracts for buying cybersecurity services. All of my results did. So I had to try using different words. I searched for information security, and these results were more promising. Scrolling down, we find the possibilities. And this is the clause, or this is the area I was looking for. Basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems. Note that this applies to everything where a contractor system could contain federal contract information except for commercial off-the-shelf items, COTS. And that's a topic for another webinar. What if it's not in the FAR? Well, you can do some more online research. Look in the Code of Federal Regulations. If someone gives you a quote or a reference and you can't find it in the FAR or the Code of Federal Regulations, you might be able to find it on the SBA website or the GSA website or in some other regulations like FAA's FAST. You can ask the contracting officer, and you can also ask an Apex Accelerator procurement counselor. I hope we left enough time for you to hang in there with me with questions and answers. But one real quick tip as a bonus, you can find a complete list of federal executive agencies with links to their websites to learn more at the Federal Acquisition Jump Test Station. And thank you for coming so far with me today.